In this segment, I want to talk about free will and some of its connections to time travel and the laws of nature. So let me start with a thought experiment. So this is Susan's timeline. And here is Susan, and she's going to the ice cream shop. You happen to know Susan very, very well. And you know that the only ice cream flavor she likes is chocolate. So you're able to make a very accurate prediction. You know that a little bit into the future, she's going to buy a chocolate ice cream. Now consider the following question. Does that mean that Susan is not free to choose any flavor she wants? No, of course not. It's rather that you know Susan so well that you're able to issue an accurate prediction about how she will exercise her free will. There's a different, this is the actual timeline. There's a different timeline where instead of choosing chocolate, Susan chooses vanilla, makes a different decision, chooses vanilla instead of chocolate, and things work differently. So for example, people around her can see yellow ice cream instead of brown ice cream, and so forth. So we have this actual scenario and we have a counterfactual scenario. And because you're able to issue your prediction, you know that this is the actual world and that's not. But that tells you nothing whatsoever about whether Susan was free. Now consider a different case. So suppose that, again, we have our timeline, and again, Susan is heading to the ice cream store. But this time you don't know Susan well at all, so you have no idea what ice cream flavor she's likely to pick. But there is a time traveler who comes back from the future and informs you that Susan will in fact have chocolate. So assuming that you believe the time traveler, you again have information about what the actual timeline is like. You know that Susan will order chocolate. So let's ask the same question one more time. Should we conclude that Susan is not free to pick some other flavor? No, because just like in this case, you were able to issue an accurate prediction about how Susan would exercise her free will. In this case, the time traveler is giving you an accurate account of how Susan exercised her free will, as seen from the future, or an accurate account of how Susan will exercise her free will, as seen from the present time. Again, we can consider a counterfactual scenario in which Susan makes a slightly different decision. And orders strawberry. And of course, if we lived in this different counterfactual scenario, what would happen is that the time traveler would have come back and reported something different. The time traveler would have reported that Susan was going to have strawberry instead of chocolate. So in both cases, the fact that we have information about the future does not entail that our subject failed to act freely. And in fact, we had already seen an example of this. So suppose that your friend Susan is having breakfast with you, and she tells you that last night she was planning to go on a train trip to Alaska. even before she finishes her story, you know that she didn't succeed. Because if she had succeeded, she would be on the train to Alaska. She wouldn't be having breakfast with you. So you have information about the future that's enough to determine how Susan's story will end, but that does not give you any information about whether Susan failed to act freely. So it's consistent with everything you know, including your information about the future, that Susan exercised her free will in deciding not to go to Alaska. It's also consistent with your story that her decision was not free. Perhaps she was prevented from getting on the train by an anxious friend. But the crucial point is that just because you have information about the future, that does not mean that Susan did not act freely. So let me now consider how the laws of nature might come into this. So let's once more consider Susan's timeline. There she is. She's heading to the ice cream store. And now suppose that you have some laws of nature that allow you to issue predictions about what the future is going to be like on the basis of the past. And let's suppose that you can use those rules, those laws, to calculate that Susan is going to order chocolate. Does that mean that Susan did not act freely? Well, not necessarily. That depends on how we think about the laws of nature. And one way of thinking about the laws of nature give us information about how the timeline will develop, but it gives us no information about whether that's the way things had to develop. So an analogy is this. On this way of thinking about the laws, it's a little bit as if you had a time traveler who came and said, I've been to the future and I can give you partial information. I'm not going to give you enough information. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened. What I'm going to tell you instead is that things always happen so that F equals ma, as it might be. So your time-traveling friend has given you partial information about the timeline, but given that you have some information about what the past is like, you can use the information your friend gave you to calculate what the rest of the timeline is like. Now, suppose you have such a time-traveling friend. Does it follow that Susan does not act freely when she orders chocolate? Well, no. Just as in these two cases, the fact that we have information about the future, in this case, information about how the future depends on the past, does not mean that Susan doesn't act freely, because for all that's been said, this might be information about how Susan will in fact exercise her free will. So let me tell you more about this way of thinking about the laws. So think of the world as a mosaic. So each of these is a point in space-time, and these points have different features. So some have mass, some have negative charge, and so forth. And we live in an orderly world. That means that the features of these points are not random. They satisfy patterns. So there's a way about thinking about the laws of nature where all the laws do is they describe the patterns. And if you have enough information about the patterns, then you can use information about how the world is like at one particular time to calculate how the world is going to be at a future time, because you know what the pattern is. So if that's all the laws tell us, if all the laws do is describe the pattern of the world, then all they do is identify the actual timeline. they do not tell us anything about whether or not Susan might have made a different decision. Now, there is a stronger way of thinking about the laws. That is a conception of the laws where the laws aren't just describing what the pattern is like. The laws go on to say that the pattern couldn't have been any other way. So if that was so, then it's definitely the case that Susan, who is subject to these laws, couldn't have acted in any other way. The crucial thing to keep in mind is that this stronger interpretation of the laws is not the only possible way of interpreting the laws. And if we interpret them in the weaker way, then there is no tension between having a deterministic system of laws, that is, a system of laws that allow us to calculate what the future is like on the basis of the past, and free will.